Thanks for letting me come and speak to you today. My name's Andy. I'm a senior developer at Evolution New Media, who are based here in Sheffield, just at the back of West Bar, where the Fire Brigade Museum is. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the dramatic history of the web browser. So I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but 2020 actually marks the 30th anniversary of the very first web browser, and essentially the World Wide Web as well. So in 1990, over at CERN in Switzerland, Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web, and as part of that he gave us the first web server, web page and web browser. And he called this first web browser World Wide Web, which is all one word to distinguish it from the World Wide Web, confusingly. He later realised that this was not as obvious a distinction as he'd like, so he renamed it Nexus. This here is actually a screenshot of that first browser. As you can see, it's all grayscale. This is actually what it would have looked like. This is because it only ran on a Next computer, and one of the limitations of that machine was that it was only a grayscale display. As you can see, it's also very basic compared to what we would consider a web browser today. It was pretty much text only. However, it could do styles. So whereas now we have style sheets with CSS, they didn't have that back then, but you could define the styles that pages would render via the software as opposed to the web page. And another important feature of this browser was that, as well as being able to use it to consume information, you could also edit it directly. Because one of Tim Berners-Lee's visions for his World Wide Web was that it would be something that not only did we go online to view information, but we contribute back and be able to edit the pages directly. So if anyone's interested to see whether today's modern web pages work in this original browser, CERN organised some people to build a emulator of that browser. I think they did this last year, and you can view it at worldwideweb.cern.ch. Unsurprisingly, most web pages won't render in it, because these days we have things like JavaScript and style sheets that just weren't a thing back then. So over the years that follow, the web starts to grow, primarily amongst the international science community. So it's your university departments and physics research facilities. They all start getting on board with the web. Because there's a big diversity in the number of machines being used, it means there's lots of different browsers being developed for the different platforms. By the time we get to 1993, we get one of the first, one of the first significant browsers in the history of the browser. So the National Centre for Supercomputing Applications, the NCSA, they released Mosaic this year. Now, this organisation is based at the University of Illinois. The browser introduces a number of key features that are common in today's modern web browsers. So things like your browser history and favourites or bookmarks, whatever you want to call them. It's Mosaic that introduced those to the browser. But one of the most significant developments was that they allowed you to start embedding images directly into your web page. So prior to this, if images were included on a web page, it would have just shown as a link. You'd have clicked the link and the image would have opened in a new window. With Mosaic, they allowed you to actually embed images so that they'd appear alongside the text. The other important feature of this browser was that it worked across multiple platforms. So it was available for Windows, Mac, Unix and Amiga systems. And thanks to this and things like the embedding of images, it quickly became regarded as one of the most popular browsers. Technically, it's the world's first most popular browser. And it really helped get the web out there to the general public, whereas before it had been very much within the science community. It started to expand and go out into the real world. Now, one of the developers of the Mosaic browser was a guy called Mark Andreessen. He was a student at the University of Illinois, and he graduated in the summer of '93. And he left his job at the NCSA and moved to California. Now, it's here that he met a guy called Jim Clark. Now, Jim could see the commercial prospects and possibilities of the Mosaic browser, and so the two of them founded the Mosaic Communications Corporation and started work on a new web browser that they codenamed Mozilla, as in Mosaic Killer. The University of Illinois weren't very happy about them using the Mosaic name, and so they had to rebrand, and they became the Netscape Communications Corporation. And towards the end of 1994, they released the first version of their browser that they named Netscape Navigator. So Navigator quickly took over Mosaic as the most popular browser out there. One of the most significant changes that they made over Mosaic was that it could start rendering pages whilst still downloading assets. So with Mosaic, if a web page had images on it, you'd have to wait until everything had downloaded before it'd start rendering the page. With Netscape, once it got the text, it would start rendering that, and the images would download in the background. Considering at the time internet connections were very slow, this was a major bonus because it meant people could get on, start reading and consuming information much faster. Obviously, with slow internet connections, it meant that people wouldn't go and download the web browser like we would commonly do today. So the way you would obtain a copy of Navigator was commonly via floppy disk. So one floppy disk could contain the whole installation files for Netscape Navigator. I've worked out that if you were to try and put the installation files for Chrome on floppy disk today, it'd take about 55 plus. So the browser's really changed. There's a lot more code there now. So these disks were generally distributed a couple of ways. It was very common to go out and buy an internet starter kit book from your local bookshop. These often included the floppy disk with the Navigator installation files on. And Netscape had also done a number of deals with internet service providers who would distribute disks to their customers. So Mosaic's been developed by the NCSA. Spyglass Inc. are an offshoot of them, and it's their job to try and license codebase to try and make some money. They've got their own version of Mosaic, the Spyglass Mosaic codebase, and they get it licensed to a number of different companies and organisations. The most significant one is Microsoft, who in 1995 released the first ever version of Internet Explorer. So the first version of Internet Explorer was based off the Mosaic code. One of the most significant things Microsoft did was they made IE freely available to all Windows users. This is significant because if you wanted to use Navigator, it was only free to use if you were a non-profit. So most businesses using Navigator to get online were having to pay Netscape, pay for a license to actually use it as software. Windows changed that and started the ball rolling with us starting to move towards having freely available web browsers. And something that often takes a lot of people by surprise is that in 1996, Microsoft also released versions of IE for Mac and Unix. So in the early days, Internet Explorer worked across multiple platforms. So from the mid to late 90s, we get a period that's commonly referred to as the browser war. So in 1996, 4 in 5 people are using Netscape Navigator, and everyone at the time is beginning to become very aware of the importance of the web, and Microsoft are very keen to make sure that their browser is at the forefront of that. So they're very keen to change this statistic. And so we go into a period where the two big corporations are fighting against each other, trying to produce the best possible browser and get the most users. This leads to a period where basically you have two browsers that are being actively developed but going in completely different directions in many cases. One place this was very noticeable was with the available HTML tags that the two browsers offered. Infamously, Netscape gave us the blink tag, which gave you flashing text. Meanwhile, Microsoft introduced the marquee tag, which allowed you to put scrolling text on your web page. These, amongst many other tags, worked in one browser and not the other, and vice versa. And this led to a number of websites being developed that worked in one browser but not the other one. And so it was quite common to see websites with badges on that said this site works best in Microsoft Internet Explorer, or this site works best in Netscape Navigator. Cross-browser support wasn't quite the thing that it is today, where we consciously try and make sure our web page works in as many browsers as possible. Another difference was that IE was very quick to adopt the newly found CSS standards for style sheets. Meanwhile, Netscape wanted to go and try something a bit different, so they came up with JSSS, which is JavaScript style sheets. So Netscape are the developers of the original JavaScript language, and they were keen to extend that into the style sheet world. They were the only browser to implement this, and it didn't take off, so eventually they would switch to using CSS as well. So up to now, IE has generally been regarded as inferior to Netscape Navigator, but things start to change with the arrival of Internet Explorer 4. So in the October of '97, Microsoft organises a big release party for their new browser. And as part of that, they organise a 10-foot tall letter E, the symbol of their browser, to be at the event. Now, somehow this makes its way onto the front lawns of Netscape's offices by the end of the evening with the sign, "From the IE team, we love you." The next morning, the Netscape employees came in to discover this and were quick to knock it down, and planted on top of it the mascot of their browser, the Mozilla dinosaur, with a new sign reading Netscape 72, Microsoft 18. This was the market share of the two browsers at the time. So one of the big things that came in with Internet Explorer 4 was a change in the rendering engine. So as I've said, that Spyglass Inc. had licensed the Mosaic codebase to Microsoft for Internet Explorer. Unfortunately, they weren't very happy with the way Microsoft were dealing with things. They were meant to be paying a minimum quarterly fee, to Spyglass, which they were paying, but they were also meant to be paying a percentage share of the revenue from distribution of the Internet Explorer browser. They weren't paying this because their argument was they were giving it away for free, so therefore there was no revenue to pass on. Spyglass threatened Microsoft with a contractual audit, and eventually it was settled that Microsoft would give Spyglass $8 million, and they would switch to using their own in-house built rendering engine known as Trident. And Trident's the rendering engine that would remain with Microsoft's Internet Explorer until its very final version, Internet Explorer 11, many years later. This basically ended Microsoft's relationship with the Mosaic browser that it had started several years before. So as the browser wars continued and we went further through the 90s, Explorer began to become much faster and more stable than Navigator. So whereas it had been seen as inferior, that started to change. One of the problems was that around this time we started to see people using tables for layout to make websites look more interesting. It's something we tend to mock now because we kind of frown on that as a process, but back then it was pretty revolutionary. And unfortunately, Navigator didn't really handle it very well. It had a tendency to crash and freeze. Considering your internet connections was pretty poor back then, if your page froze and you had to refresh and you had to wait for it to download again, it was less than ideal, and often you'd have to do this multiple times. So people started to move over towards Explorer, and it's also around this time Microsoft started bundling Internet Explorer with Windows itself. So up till now, if you wanted Internet Explorer with the earlier versions, you would have had to have gone out and obtained the installation files similar to what you would have done with Netscape Navigator, so found floppy disks with the files on. But towards the end of the 90s, Microsoft started bundling it in with Windows. So if you go and buy a new Windows computer, it would come pre-installed with a web browser, at which point there was very little need to go and look for an alternative. This all got the attention of the United States government, and in 1998 they launched an antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft Corporation. Basically, the US government wasn't very happy about the fact that Microsoft were using their monopoly of the personal computing market to squeeze out competition. And as part of the lawsuit, they actually referenced the browser war that had been going on and how Microsoft had been actively pushing out Netscape from the market. This would go on for a few years, this court case, and it was eventually decided that Microsoft would have to be split up into smaller independent companies. Obviously that's not what happened. Microsoft appealed, and in 2001 it was agreed that they'd have to give third parties access to their APIs. But in terms of the browser wars, this was all a little too late. Because in 2001, 9 in 10 browsers are now Internet Explorer. It's also this year that they released everyone's favourite browser, Internet Explorer 6. It wasn't a terrible browser back in 2001, but the problem was that it would be the last major release of an Internet Explorer browser for many years. As a result, with their dominance of the browser market shares, it kind of stifled innovation because it didn't matter what other browsers were doing to advance the web. You had to make sure your website ran in IE6 to be able to reach the most number of customers that you are trying to attract. As a result, it really stifled innovation. So this really marks the end of an era. Netscape have lost the war to Microsoft. Back in 1998, AOL actually bought Netscape, and they did continue development of the Navigator browser for about 10 years from that point. They were never able to reclaim the lost market share and eventually gave up. But it's important to remember that Netscape gave us many things that have become integral to today's modern web. Things like JavaScript, being able to use animated GIFs in your web pages, and cookies. We have Netscape to thank for these. But the other thing that happened in 1998 was that Netscape open sourced much of their code base. And the Mozilla organization was founded so that they could be guardians of this new open source code. And this really marks the beginning of a new open web ecosystem that is basically where we are now, where we have various browsers that all work off open source code. So before I continue talking about Mozilla, I just want to bring another browser into the equation, Conqueror, developed by KDE for Linux. Now you're probably wondering why I'm mentioning this, because I suspect most people here have either never heard of it or at least never used it. But it's a really important browser in the story of the history of the web browser. So Conqueror, unlike all the browsers I've introduced so far, it's the first one that was open source from the beginning. It had virtually no corporate backing, and it used the KHTML rendering engine that they developed, as well as KJS, which was the JavaScript engine, both open source. And they were more standards compliant than either, Conqueror was more standards compliant than either Navigator or Explorer. And it's around this time that Apple are looking to replace Internet Explorer from their desktops. So Apple's not very happy that when you log on to a Mac, if you want to go online onto the web, you were having to use their rival Microsoft's web browser to do that. So they were looking for an alternative. At the time, many people thought they'd look to Mozilla. That's not what happened. They took the surprise decision of quietly forking the Conqueror code and developing a new browser based off of that. And in 2003, they released Safari and WebKit. So WebKit is a fork of KHTML. And at the time that they announced this, they also wrote back to the Conqueror developers, and they informed them of what they'd done, and basically wanted to thank them and praise them for their code base. They cited that the clean code they developed that was so easy to work with and the standards compliance were the things that attracted them towards Conqueror. And they offered to push back the improvements and fixes that they had done to WebKit back into the KHTML code base. Unfortunately, because several years had passed since they originally forked it, the code bases had diverged and it proved somewhat problematic to push things back, and eventually Conqueror would switch to using WebKit themselves. So this leads me to what some people refer to as the second browser war. I put a question mark here because I'm not completely convinced it was a war in the same sense that the first one was. Though this was more a period of healthy competition between various rival browsers. And then you had Microsoft, who was still dominant on the market and weren't really doing very much to compete because they didn't need to, because IE6 was still ruling. So in 2004, Mozilla, who have inherited the code from Netscape, they release Firefox. This is using the Gecko rendering engine, which was something that Netscape were developing in the 90s, but never made its way into Navigator itself. So Mozilla picked up where Netscape had left off and continued to develop it, and then that became the Firefox web browser. So some of you may remember that in 2003 there were some earlier releases of Firefox that came under a different name. To start with, they released Phoenix, which Phoenix Technologies in the States weren't very happy about because it was their brand name. So they threatened legal action. So Mozilla had to change and it became Firebird. Again, this was a name being used by other people. So to avoid legal action, they switched to the name Firefox that they believed was unique and quirky and stuck to this day. Obviously, compared to Microsoft, they're quite a small organization, so they had to find a way of trying to get people on board and using Firefox. So they launched a marketing campaign known as Spread Firefox that ran for a number of years towards the beginning of Firefox's release. This proved very successful for them. They did a number of different things. One of the first things they did was they crowdfunded a 2-page ad in the New York Times to announce the release of their browser. And then a few years later, they also did a thing where, I don't know if anyone knows this, but Firefox is another name for a red panda. So they sponsored a couple of red panda cubs at Knoxville Zoo, and they live streamed them on their website. And then the more people downloaded and installed Firefox, the more toys these cubs got to play with, and you could watch them on the website. So within the first year, they'd got 100 million downloads, which is not bad. Firefox introduced a number of things that have become common on web browsers now. So they really popularized the concept of tabbed browsing. Tab browsing had technically been introduced by the Opera browser, which had been around since the mid-90s, but Opera was had a much smaller user base, and so really it was Firefox that popularized it as a concept. We also have Firefox to thank for the web developer tools that are now commonplace in today's browsers, because we had the Firebug plugin, which gave us developer tools that we could use with Firefox. So by 2006, 85% of people are still using Internet Explorer, but Firefox now accounts for about 10%, which is not bad going. 2006 is the year that Microsoft finally get a new version of Internet Explorer released. So Internet Explorer 7 comes out. This is their attempt to try and get up to the standards that some of their rivals are now building. They don't quite meet the standards that what people were looking for, but they did introduce things like tabs and search, which had become a common feature in the toolbar of browsers by this point. Unfortunately for Microsoft, 2006 is the year that another competitor was about to appear on the market, and one that was really going to properly challenge them. Because in 2006, Google released Chrome. Now, to start with, the CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, was opposed to the idea of Google having a web browser. He had witnessed the fiercely fought out battle between Netscape and Microsoft in the late 90s and didn't believe that it was something that Google should risk getting involved with if there was a second war. Basically, he saw that company was too small and too young, and basically developing a browser could have sunk them. However, co-founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page had hired some Mozilla developers, and they'd been actively working on a new web browser. They showed it to H. Schmidt, and his response was, "It was so good that it essentially forced me to change my mind." And so through a 38-page comic, they announced to the world their new web browser, Google Chrome, and the corresponding Chromium browser, which is the open source browser that Chrome is built upon. So Chromium uses WebKit, which is the rendering engine that was developed by Apple from the Conqueror code. Amongst the pages of the comic, they actually praise the open source community and mention Mozilla and WebKit. So by 2013, the market shares have completely changed. Google Chrome is looking at over a third of the market now, and Internet Explorer has sunk to under a quarter. Meanwhile, Firefox and Safari have been steadily increasing their shares. The reason I mention 2013 is this is the year that Google decided to leave behind WebKit, and they forked it to create Blink, a new rendering engine, because basically WebKit wasn't really it was kind of slowing down development in the direction they wanted to go. So they forked it. They were very grateful for WebKit, but decided it was time to sort of sever ties. I just want to take a moment to mention the fact that because Chromium is an open source browser, there are a number of browsers that have spun off of that. So we have the likes of Brave, Samsung Internet and Vivaldi. These are all Chromium based browsers. So Brave is very privacy conscious. Samsung Internet is the one that if you use a Samsung Galaxy phone, you're probably using Samsung Internet as your default browser. Vivaldi is from a breakaway group from developers that were building the Opera browser. And it's in 2013 Opera had also switched from using their Presto rendering engine to using Chromium's Blink. So by 2015, Microsoft had decided that Internet Explorer has just got too bad a reputation, and so they released a completely new browser called Edge. Edge uses a new rendering engine called Edge HTML, but again, this is just a fork. This time it's a fork of the Trident rendering engine. That is the rendering engine that they had developed to break away from Mosaic codebase back in the 90s. So although it's using a fork of Trident, this has been an opportunity for them to really clean up their codebase, get rid of the deprecations and really modernize it. And in fairness to Microsoft, they didn't do a bad job. However, they still couldn't really take back the share of the market they'd lost. So this shows the market share of the different browsers from 2009 to 2018. As you can see, Internet Explorer was really dominant at the start of this period, and then towards the end of it, Chrome has completely replaced them. This little sliver up here represents where Edge is, and sadly Firefox has gradually sort of seen a decline in its users. Meanwhile, Safari has grown. This can be partly explained by the fact that over this period we started to see people use smartphones as one of their main ways of getting online and using the web. Anyone using an iPhone or an iPad, doesn't matter which browser you're using, it's technically Safari and the WebKit rendering engine, because that's one of the limited restrictions applied by Apple to browser developers. They have to use the WebKit rendering engine, so essentially they're just wrappers around Safari. It's not the same case on Android. Android's a lot freer, so many of the Firefox browsers that are available for Android are actually using Gecko rather than Blink as the rendering engine. And then that brings us up to today. So a couple of weeks ago, a new version of Edge was released that's actually based off of Chromium. So a couple of years ago, Microsoft decided that it was time to give up on Edge HTML and switch to using Chromium's Blink. Probably driven by financial reasons, because really they're not making the dent in the browser markets that they would have liked. And everyone's just using Chromium-based browsers, so it kind of made sense to switch there. And also, they'd already had developers working with Chromium for the Edge browser that ran on Android phones, so they already had some expertise in that area. So this came out just 2 weeks ago, and it kind of brings Microsoft back to its early days where it had a browser that worked across multiple platforms, because the new version of Edge works on Windows and Mac OS. And of course, 2020 marks the 30th anniversary of that first web browser that I introduced at the beginning of the talk, World Wide Web. So just finally, consider the future of web browsers. One of the things that history teaches us is that it has a tendency to repeat itself. So one of the common threads that we see through the history of the browser is that we have browsers that come, dominate, and then go into decline and disappear. So to start with, we had Mosaic, which was quickly replaced by Netscape Navigator, which would then go on to be replaced by Internet Explorer. And then Internet Explorer was essentially replaced by Chrome, and the Chromium-based browsers that have dominated in recent years. Which means there's in all probability the Chrome browser will eventually go into decline and be replaced by something else. And if you look at the market shares over the last few years, there's starting to be signs that maybe Chrome has actually peaked and is starting to decline in user base. However, the Chromium browsers as a whole are still very dominant. I think one of the reasons we might be seeing people move away from Google Chrome is because people are now becoming very conscious of privacy online, and Google and privacy don't really go together that well. So people are looking at alternatives out there. Just to finish, I'm going to leave you with this quote. This comes from a guy called Adam Barth, who was a Chromium software engineer at the time that Chromium decided to switch from using WebKit to Blink. At the time he wrote, "We believe that having multiple rendering engines, similar to having multiple browsers, will spur innovation and over time improve the health of the entire open web ecosystem." So I put it to you that anyone that's working in the web industry and building websites, it's kind of our responsibility, our duty to try and protect that open web ecosystem. And so wherever feasible, we need to be making sure that we're testing on as many browsers as possible and as many rendering engines to try and avoid going back to the days where we had a very dominant Internet Explorer that was stifling innovation on the web. Because if we want the web to keep growing and developing, we need things to keep moving forward. And if we end up with just one browser or rendering engine that dominates, we run the risk that development of that rendering engine will start to slow, and the rivals just won't be able to. They can bring out new features, but people won't be able to start using them because they'll have to make sure it's supported in the dominant browser of the day. So if Google Chrome is your default browser today, I'm not going to shame you for using it. I use Google Chrome myself. But I recommend trying some of the alternatives out there. There are many good browsers using different rendering engines, offering different tools and features. And it may just turn out that one of those browsers is better suited to your own personal needs. So that's it. If anyone has any questions, I'll try and answer.
Are there any South Asian versions, Chinese versions, that we should be aware of?
Yes. I believe this one is called Maxathon, I think, and that's developed by a Chinese company. I suspect there are probably a lot more, but I suspect they're bigger in China than over here, but I know Maxathon is available over here.
Any specific features of them that we should be aware of?
Of any of the browsers?
Of that Maxathon that you said.
Maxathon. I'm not very familiar with it myself, so I don't know what that offers. I think it's just that it's being developed in China, because I think it's being developed by their equivalent of Google, so it's probably more geared to, I'd imagine it's got better support for the Chinese language, which I would imagine many Western browsers probably aren't so great at. Yeah.
JavaScript style sheet's completely dead now, though. I'm just looking for an alternative to CSS, to be honest.
I don't think you're going to find one. CSS is just the dominant style sheet thing. Basically, I only kind of came across it when I was doing my research into the talk, but it kind of looks like JavaScript, like if you were just styling elements directly through JavaScript, it's kind of got served in style tags, so it's kind of like you could just use JavaScript to style your page, which kind of would be a bit like JavaScript style sheets, but not quite. But I think you're better sticking with CSS than going that route. So, yeah. Anyone else?